January 17, 1944. Kwajalein Atoll, Marshall Islands. 0700 hours. The morning sun broke over the Pacific like molten copper spilling across an endless anvil of blue. Lieutenant Commander Takashi Yamamoto stood on the coral outcrop of Roinamore Island, binoculars trembling in his salt-crusted hands. The horizon had changed. Where yesterday there had been only ocean and sky, now there were shapes, hundreds of shapes, gray hulls arranged in geometric precision that seemed to mock the very concept of chaos. He had served the Emperor for 19 years, had witnessed the conquest of Manchuria, had stood aboard the carrier decks that struck Pearl Harbor, but he had never seen anything like this. The American fleet stretched from one edge of his vision to the other, a steel constellation that pulsed with purpose. Behind him, his men were eating their morning ration of rice mixed with dried fish, their faces still creased with sleep. None of them yet understood that they were looking at the future of warfare itself, a future in which they had no place. The radio operator called out coordinates, his voice cracking with the strain of professional composure. Yamamoto lowered his binoculars and closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw his daughter's face, the way she had looked at him when he left Yokohama 3 years ago, her small hand waving a paper flag. He wondered if she would remember him. He wondered if any of them would be remembered at all, or if they would simply vanish into the machinery of what was coming, swallowed whole by an enemy that did not merely fight wars but choreographed them like some vast, terrible ballet. The first shells began to fall at 0712 hours. They came in waves, methodical as breathing, each salvo adjusted by calculations performed on ships equipped with fire control systems that represented more technological advancement than existed in all of Japan's naval arsenal combined. Yamamoto did not know this. He knew only that the Earth was being redesigned around him, that coral and concrete and human flesh were being rendered into their constituent atoms with a precision that felt personal, as though each shell had been addressed to him specifically. To understand what happened at Kwajalein, to truly comprehend the paralysis that gripped Japanese commanders from the Marshalls to the Philippines to the home islands themselves, one must first understand what they had been taught to expect. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had built their doctrine on principles forged in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, refined in China, and perfected at Singapore and the Philippines. Theirs was a philosophy of Saipan, spirit, fighting will, the intangible force that could overcome material disadvantage. When Japanese forces had stormed ashore at Malaya in 1941, they had done so with bicycles and captured trucks, with artillery pieces hauled through jungle by sheer human determination. They had won because they moved faster, struck harder, and cared less for their own survival than their enemies cared for theirs. Every training manual, every officer's lecture, every midnight toast in the wardrooms reinforced this central truth, that Bushido, the way of the warrior, was the ultimate weapon, that no amount of American industrial capacity could substitute for the purified soul of the Japanese soldier. But Kwajalein revealed something the Imperial General Staff had not accounted for in their calculations. The Americans were not merely industrialists. They were systematizers. They were engineers of violence on a scale that transcended individual courage, that rendered Saipan as quaint as a samurai sword in the age of the machine gun. What Japanese commanders witnessed in the Marshall Islands was not simply an amphibious assault. It was the application of scientific method to the problem of human conflict, a transformation of war itself from an art into a process, repeatable and scalable, as predictable as an assembly line in Detroit. The invasion plan for Kwajalein comprised 473 pages of operational orders. It included tide tables calculated to the minute, weather forecasts derived from meteorological data gathered across 1,000 miles of ocean, aerial reconnaissance photographs so detailed that American planners could count the individual palm trees on each islet. Every Marine and soldier knew not only his objective but the objectives of the units to his left and right, the timing of naval gunfire support, the exact beach coordinates where he would land, and the predetermined rally points if separated from his squad. This was not improvisation. This was not Saipan. This was something the Japanese military vocabulary had no word for. It was coordination elevated to the level of philosophy, abundance weaponized into doctrine. The Americans came ashore at 0930 hours on February 1, 1944, preceded by a bombardment that had lasted 4 days and consumed more ordnance than Japan produced in 6 months. The landing craft moved in waves, each wave timed to arrive as the previous wave cleared the beach. LVT-1 alligators, tracked amphibious vehicles that could crawl over coral reefs that would have shredded conventional landing craft, carried the first assault troops. Behind them came LVT-2s modified as armored personnel carriers. Behind those, Sherman tanks sealed in waterproofed hulls, their engines wrapped in rubber and canvas, their crews breathing through snorkels as they drove through 6 feet of salt water. The choreography was so precise that naval gunfire lifted from each beach sector exactly 90 seconds before the first Marines stepped onto sand, shifted inland in a rolling barrage that moved forward at a predetermined rate of 100 yards every 3 minutes, a curtain of steel that the infantry followed like dancers following a spotlight. Captain Yoshiro Tanaka, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 157th Infantry Regiment, watched this procession from his bunker on the southern tip of Kwajalein Island. He had been given 300 men to defend a sector 200 meters wide. He had 14 machine guns, 2 37mm anti-tank guns, and 6 months of instruction that the Americans would break under determined resistance, that their casualties would sap their will, that their soft democratic society had not prepared them for the meat grinder of island warfare. He had been told about Tarawa, where the 2nd Marine Division had suffered 3,300 casualties in 76 hours. He had been assured that such losses would make America reconsider its Pacific offensive, that public opinion would demand negotiation, that Japan's defensive perimeter would hold. What Tanaka saw now made a mockery of these assurances. The Americans did not charge his bunker. They did not expose themselves to his machine gun fire. Instead, a tank, one of 8 that had landed in the first wave, positioned itself 300 meters from his position and began systematically destroying his firing ports with 75mm shells. While the tank fired, infantry squads maneuvered to flanking positions, their movements covered by smoke grenades deployed with such timing that there was never a moment when Tanaka's gunners had a clear field of fire. When the flanking squads reached their positions, they did not attack. They waited. A radio call went out. Tanaka could hear the American voices crackling across frequencies his own radio operator was monitoring, and 6 minutes later, a naval spotter plane circled overhead and directed fire from a destroyer 3 miles offshore. The destroyer's 5-inch guns placed 8 shells directly on top of Tanaka's bunker in a span of 40 seconds. Tanaka survived because he was in the deepest corner of the structure, behind 2 layers of reinforced concrete and coral aggregate. 17 of his men did not. When the smoke cleared, he emerged to find American Marines already inside his perimeter, moving with a casualness that seemed almost contemptuous. They did not run. They walked, their rifles held at port arms, their heads swiveling in practiced arcs as they scanned for targets. Behind them, more Marines were unloading supplies from landing craft, not just ammunition and water, but hot food, medical supplies, spare uniforms, even bags of mail. On the beach, a bulldozer was already grading a path inland, and engineers were laying perforated steel planking for a temporary roadway. The Americans had been ashore for 90 minutes, and they were building infrastructure. In Tokyo, at the Imperial General Headquarters, the reports from Kwajalein were initially dismissed as exaggerations born of combat stress. Colonel Saburo Hayashi, chief of the Army General Staff's Operations Section, reviewed the dispatches with growing irritation. Commanders in the field were describing American capabilities that seemed to violate basic logistical constraints. They reported that American forces were landing with tanks in the first assault wave, impossible, since such vehicles required harbor facilities. They described naval gunfire adjusted by aircraft that maintained constant radio contact with ships, implausible, given the coordination such operations would require. They claimed that American casualties were minimal despite frontal assaults against fortified positions, absurd, contradicting every principle of military science. But the reports kept coming, not just from Kwajalein but from Inuiatak, from Saipan, from Peleliu and Guam and Tinian. Each island fell faster than the previous one. Each invasion showed the same characteristics: overwhelming preliminary bombardment, amphibious vehicles that bypassed beach obstacles, precise timing between naval gunfire and infantry advance, and, most disturbing of all, an apparent absence of the confusion and chaos that were supposed to be inherent to combat. Japanese officers trained in the Prussian military tradition understood that no plan survived contact with the enemy, that friction was the fundamental law of warfare, that even the best prepared offensive would dissolve into improvisation once the shooting started. The Americans seemed to have repealed this law. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor and now found himself relegated to administrative duties in the home islands, was asked to brief the Imperial General Staff on American amphibious doctrine. He spent 2 weeks reviewing captured documents, interrogating prisoners, and analyzing reconnaissance photographs. His conclusion, delivered in a conference room overlooking Tokyo Bay in May 1944, was met with silence. "They have made amphibious assault into an industrial process," Nagumo said, his voice flat with the exhaustion of a man who has glimpsed the future and found it intolerable. "They do not land forces. They land systems. Every man is a component. Every vehicle is calibrated to arrive at a specific time and place. They have removed human decision-making from the battlefield and replaced it with procedure. We are not fighting soldiers. We are fighting a machine that happens to be operated by soldiers." The silence that followed was not agreement. It was incomprehension. Japan's military elite had spent their careers studying Napoleon and Clausewitz, Moltke and Yamamoto. They understood maneuver and morale, logistics and firepower. But they had no conceptual framework for understanding what the Americans had created, a form of warfare in which the battle was won before the first shot was fired, in which the decisive terrain was not the beaches of Kwajalein or Saipan, but the planning rooms in Pearl Harbor and San Diego, the factories in Pittsburgh and Detroit, the training grounds at Camp Pendleton where Marines rehearsed amphibious assaults on full-scale mock-ups of enemy fortifications until every man could navigate his sector blindfolded. The symbolic heart of American amphibious doctrine was not a weapon or a vehicle but a book. It was called Landing Operations Manual, Fleet Training Publication 167, and it weighed 6 pounds. It had been written over 4 years by a committee of Marine officers, Navy planners, and civilian engineers, revised through 17 drafts, and tested in exercises from the Carolinas to the Caribbean. It contains sections on everything from the optimal spacing between landing craft to the psychological effects of pre-invasion bombardment, from the maintenance of amphibious tractors in tropical conditions to the caloric requirements of men fighting in high heat and humidity. It was, in essence, the codification of amphibious warfare into a science, a transformation of what had always been the most chaotic form of military operation into something that could be taught, practiced, and perfected. Every officer involved in an amphibious operation possessed a copy. Every sergeant and squad leader had been trained in its principles. When Marines hit the beach at Kwajalein, they were not improvising. They were executing a script that had been written in committee rooms and validated in rehearsals, a script so detailed that even when things went wrong, when landing craft grounded on unexpected reefs, when radio communications failed, when casualties disrupted unit cohesion, there were contingency procedures, backup plans, predetermined responses that kicked in automatically. The Japanese called this American approach Kikai Rentai, machine coordination. They meant it as an insult, a suggestion that Americans fought without soul or spirit. They did not yet understand that they were witnessing the birth of modern military operations, a revolution as profound as the introduction of gunpowder or the airplane. Private First Class Robert Sullivan, a rifleman in the 4th Marine Division, wrote a letter to his sister 3 days after landing at Kwajalein. The letter was intercepted by military censors and filed in the National Archives, where it remains today, a small piece of evidence in a larger truth. "We practiced this landing 12 times at Camp Pendleton," Sullivan wrote in his cramped, careful handwriting. 12 times we loaded into the Higgins boats, 12 times we hit the beach at exactly 0930 hours, 12 times we moved inland to the tree-line and dug in at the rally point. When we did it for real, it was exactly the same, except people were shooting at us. But we knew what to do. We had done it a dozen times already. It felt like practice, even when it wasn't. This was the secret that Japanese commanders could not comprehend. The Americans had turned warfare into repetition, had transformed the unknowable chaos of combat into a known sequence of events. Marines landing at Kwajalein had muscle memory for the invasion. They had performed these movements so many times that they no longer required thought, no longer required courage in the traditional sense. Courage was for the unknown. This was merely execution, the application of training to circumstance, the conversion of potential energy into kinetic force through the mechanism of procedure. The transformation in American military thinking had not come easily or quickly. As recently as Guadalcanal in 1942, American amphibious operations had been characterized by the same confusion and improvisation that defined such assaults in every previous war. Landing craft had deposited men in the wrong sectors. Naval gunfire had failed to suppress defensive positions. Supplies had piled up on beaches while men at the front ran out of ammunition. The early Pacific campaigns were won through individual heroism and numerical superiority, through the same qualities of courage and determination that Japanese doctrine celebrated. But American military planners did not mistake these victories for competence. They saw inefficiency, waste of material, waste of time, waste of lives. And American culture, steeped in the gospel of efficiency that had built transcontinental railroads and assembly line factories, viewed waste as a sin more profound than defeat. So they studied. They analyzed. They tested. After Tarawa, where inadequate reconnaissance had led to landing craft grounding on reefs and marines wading through chest-deep water under machine gun fire, the Navy established the underwater demolition teams, frogmen who would survey every invasion beach in advance, mapping obstacles and water depths with precision that allowed landing craft coxswains to navigate to within meters of their assigned sectors. After Saipan, where supply bottlenecks had threatened to stall the offensive, logistics officers developed new procedures for beachhead organization, creating designated unloading zones for different classes of supplies, establishing traffic control points, even painting color-coded signs that could be driven into the sand to guide truck drivers. Each operation built on the lessons of the previous one. Each after-action report became raw material for revision of doctrine. The Americans treated warfare the way Henry Ford had treated automobile production, as a problem to be solved through systematic improvement. By the time Marines landed at Iwo Jima in February 1945, this process had reached its apotheosis. The invasion plan for that 8-square-mile island ran to 900 pages. Preliminary bombardment lasted 74 days. Underwater demolition teams made 11 separate reconnaissance runs, mapping every meter of the invasion beaches. Naval gunfire support ships carried detailed three-dimensional maps of the island created from stereoscopic aerial photographs, allowing gun directors to target specific bunkers and caves that had been identified and numbered weeks before the invasion. Even the weather was factored into operations with a precision that would have seemed like magic to commanders of an earlier generation. Meteorological officers aboard the command ship USS El Dorado maintained constant contact with weather stations across the Pacific, predicting cloud cover and wind speed 3 days in advance to determine optimal conditions for air support. Japanese commanders on Iwo Jima, led by General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, understood that they faced something unprecedented. Kurabayashi was not a typical Japanese officer. He had served as a military attaché in Washington in the 1920s, had traveled across America by car, had visited factories and farms and universities. He knew American industrial capacity was vast, but he had assumed, as most Japanese officers assumed, that capacity alone could not win wars, that there remained an intangible quality to combat that favored the warrior over the mechanic. On Iwo Jima, commanding 21,000 men in a fortress that had taken 8 months to construct, he finally understood the full dimension of his error. The Marines landed at 0900 hours on February 19, 1945. They came in 10 waves, each wave precisely timed, each unit assigned to a specific beach sector identified by colored flags and coordinated grid references. Kurabayashi, watching from his command post in the island's interior, held his fire for 30 minutes, a calculated decision designed to allow maximum American forces to crowd onto the beach before triggering the ambush. When his artillery finally opened up at 0930, it should have been devastating. His guns had pre-registered every meter of the landing beaches, his mortars were positioned in caves that made counter-battery fire almost impossible, and his machine guns were sighted to create interlocking fields of fire that would turn the black volcanic sand into a killing ground. And it was devastating. In the first hour, the Marines suffered 2,500 casualties. Landing craft were hit as they approached the beach. Amtraks were disabled by mines and artillery. Men trying to dig into the soft volcanic ash found no cover, no concealment, nothing but the bodies of those who had landed ahead of them. For the Japanese defenders, watching through firing slits and periscopes, it seemed to confirm everything they had been promised, that American casualties would be unbearable, that democracy could not sustain this level of sacrifice, that eventually the weight of dead sons and brothers would force negotiation. But the Americans did not stop. More landing craft arrived, precisely on schedule, depositing more men and more supplies. Naval gunfire, disrupted initially by the need to avoid hitting friendly forces, reorganized and began systematically targeting the Japanese positions that had revealed themselves by firing. Aircraft from escort carriers offshore worked in rotation, maintaining constant air cover, bombing and strafing defensive positions based on coordinates radioed from the beach. And most tellingly, the logistical machinery continued to function. Despite the casualties, despite the chaos, supplies kept flowing ashore in an uninterrupted stream. By noon on the first day, the Marines had landed 14,000 men, 6,000 tons of supplies, and 70 tanks. By nightfall, Despite sustaining casualty rates that would have broken most military units in history, they controlled a beachhead 2 miles long and half a mile deep. Kurabayashi sent a message to Tokyo that night. It was intercepted and decoded by American intelligence, and a translation was filed in the official records of the invasion. "The Americans do not stop," he wrote. "Their casualties would force any rational army to withdraw and reconsider. But they treat casualties as a logistical problem, something to be managed rather than avoided. They evacuate wounded men with the same efficiency they use to land fresh troops. They replace damaged equipment faster than we can destroy it. We are not fighting an enemy. We are fighting a system, and the system does not feel pain." This was the psychological shock that rippled through Japanese command structures in the final year of the war, the realization that American military operations were not commanded by generals who made decisions based on courage and honor but by processes that ran according to their own logic, indifferent to individual suffering or glory. When a Marine company on Iwo Jima was decimated by artillery fire, it did not retreat or dissolve. It reformed according to pre-established procedures, absorbed replacements from designated reserve units, and continued its advance on a timetable determined not by the company commander but by the master operation plan created weeks earlier. When a Sherman tank was destroyed, another tank, identical in every specification because American industry produced standardized vehicles rather than custom machines, moved up to take its place, often crewed by men who had trained on simulators before ever seeing combat, who could operate the vehicle systems with minimal supervision because every control, every gauge, every procedure was identical to the simulators they had practiced on in California. This was the American way of war, forged not in military academies but in the culture of mass production, scientific management, and systems engineering that had transformed the United States from an agricultural nation into an industrial superpower in the span of 2 generations. It was a way of war that did not celebrate individual heroism, though heroes certainly existed, but rather minimized the need for heroism by creating systems so robust, so redundant, so thoroughly planned that even average men could achieve extraordinary results simply by following procedure. It was democratic warfare in the deepest sense, a mode of combat that did not require samurai spirit or aristocratic leadership but could be executed by farmers and factory workers, by high school graduates taught to drive bulldozers and operate radios, by citizens who would return to civilian life once the war ended and who therefore had no interest in romanticizing combat or treating war as anything other than an industrial problem requiring industrial solutions. The Japanese military leadership, steeped in a tradition that viewed warfare as the highest expression of national spirit, found this approach incomprehensible and obscene. Admiral Mato Mogaki, commander of the 5th Naval Air Fleet, wrote in his diary in June 1945, just weeks before the war's end, that American methods represented the death of warfare as an art and its replacement with bureaucracy. They do not seek decisive battle but rather the systematic reduction of our forces through processes that resemble factory work more than combat. There is no glory in how they fight, no demonstration of superior will or courage. They simply grind forward, step by predetermined step, and we have no answer to such grinding. Ogaki was not wrong, but he mistook the nature of the transformation he was witnessing. The Americans had not killed warfare as an art. They had evolved it into something beyond art, into applied science, into engineering practiced at continental scale. When Marines landed at Okinawa in April 1945, they brought with them not just weapons but the accumulated knowledge of 3 years of amphibious operations, codified into doctrine, embedded in training, expressed through the coordination of vessels and aircraft and ground units so intricate that it appeared choreographed. They brought ice cream barges and mobile surgical hospitals, fleet post offices and censorship units, graves registration teams and psychological warfare specialists. They brought, in essence, not just an invasion force but a complete system for conducting military operations in the modern age, a system that would define how wars would be fought for the next 75 years. The recurring symbol in the Japanese perception of American abundance was not a weapon or a tactic but food. Specifically, the hot meals that American forces consumed even in active combat zones. Japanese soldiers at Guadalcanal, reduced to eating grass and tree bark, had found American supply dumps containing not just rice and hardtack but canned fruit, chocolate bars, coffee, even ice cream. At Kwajalein, Marines ate hot turkey dinners on the beach 2 days after landing, served from field kitchens that had been brought ashore on dukus, amphibious trucks that could ferry supplies directly from ships to inland distribution points. At Iwo Jima, even as combat raged for the island's interior, American galleys were preparing 3 hot meals a day for frontline units, delivering them in insulated containers by Jeep and Amtrak. To Japanese soldiers who considered a ball of rice mixed with pickled plum to be a full meal, who had been taught that hunger was a test of character, this abundance was spiritually corrupting. It confirmed their suspicion that Americans were materialistic, soft, dependent on luxury. But it missed the deeper point. The hot meals were not a luxury. They were a deliberate component of American military effectiveness, based on studies showing that adequate nutrition improved combat performance, reduced sickness, and maintained morale. The food was a system like everything else, a logistical problem that had been analyzed, solved, and incorporated into operational doctrine. American quartermasters calculated caloric requirements for men fighting in tropical conditions, designed menus that could be prepared in field conditions, established supply chains that could deliver fresh food to men at the front. They approached feeding an army the way they approached every other aspect of warfare, as an engineering challenge requiring systematic solution. This was perhaps the most profound difference between American and Japanese military culture. The Japanese valorized scarcity, treated deprivation as character building, saw suffering as proof of dedication. The Americans treated scarcity as a failure of planning, deprivation as inefficiency, suffering as a problem to be solved through better logistics. When Marines landed at Peleliu with water supplies that proved inadequate for the Coral Islands' brutal heat, the after-action report identified this as a systemic failure, not an unavoidable hardship. New procedures were written. Water consumption rates were recalculated. By the next invasion, portable desalination units were available, capable of producing fresh water from seawater to supplement prepositioned supplies. Everything was studied. Everything was improved. Every operation fed data into the system, and the system adapted. Japanese forces, operating under a doctrine that had remained essentially unchanged since the Russo-Japanese War, found themselves fighting an enemy that evolved with each engagement, that learned faster and implemented changes more rapidly than their own rigid command structure could comprehend, let alone match. The Americans were not more courageous. They were not even necessarily better soldiers on an individual level. But they were components of a superior system, and in modern warfare, systems defeated spirit. The epilogue to this story begins not on a beach, but in a classroom at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, in 1946. Lieutenant Colonel James B. Ord, who had commanded a battalion at Tarawa and served on the staff planning team for Iwo Jima, was teaching the first post-war course on amphibious operations. His students were a mix of American officers and foreign observers, including 2 majors from the newly reconstituted Japanese self-defense forces. Ord spent 6 weeks walking his students through the evolution of American amphibious doctrine, from the disasters of Tarawa to the precision of Okinawa. He showed them organizational charts and time phase diagrams, fire support coordination plans, and logistics flowcharts. He explained how the United States had taken the most difficult form of military operation, landing forces on a hostile shore against prepared defenses, and transformed it from a near-suicide mission into a routine procedure. At the end of the course, one of the Japanese officers asked a question. "Colonel Ord," he said through a translator, "in your assessment, what was the decisive factor that allowed American forces to achieve such precise coordination? Was it superior technology? Superior training? The quality of your personnel?" Ord thought for a moment before answering. "It was none of those things individually," he said. "It was the belief that war is a problem that can be solved. Not won through courage or luck or the favor of God, but solved, like an engineering problem or a manufacturing challenge. We applied the same methods to warfare that we applied to building automobiles or constructing bridges. We measured, we tested, we standardized, we improved. The decisive factor was not any single technology or technique. It was a culture that refused to accept that warfare had to be chaotic, that casualties had to be high, that success had to depend on individual heroism. We built systems that allowed ordinary men to achieve extraordinary results through coordination rather than courage." The Japanese officers made notes but said nothing. They understood, perhaps better than Ord himself, what his answer revealed. The Americans had not simply won the war through industrial might or numerical superiority. They had won it by transforming warfare itself, by taking a human activity as old as civilization and subjecting it to the same rational analysis, the same systematic improvement, the same relentless optimization that had given them mass production, rural electrification, and transcontinental highways. They had democratized military effectiveness, made it accessible to citizen soldiers who would never be samurai, who had no interest in bushido or warrior codes, who wanted only to do their job, survive, and go home. This was the truth that Japanese commanders on Kwajalein and Iwo Jima had glimpsed but could never fully articulate, that they were witnessing not just a new form of warfare but a new form of human organization, one in which collective efficiency replaced individual excellence, in which systems replaced heroes, in which the machine did not dehumanize its operators but rather extended human capability beyond anything possible through courage or spirit alone. The perfectly coordinated landings were not miracles. They were products, manufactured with the same care and precision that went into building a Liberty ship or a B-29 bomber, tested and refined and delivered to specifications that would have seemed fantastical to any previous generation. And that coordination, that terrible precision, was not a temporary adaptation to the needs of war. It was the future, a future in which the decisive terrain would not be physical ground but organizational capacity, in which victory would go not to the bravest but to the most systematically efficient, in which the fundamental question would not be who can endure the most suffering, but rather who can organize complexity at the largest scale. The Americans had answered that question on the beaches of the Pacific, had written their answer in operational plans and after-action reports, in the synchronized movements of landing craft and the timed delivery of naval gunfire, in the hot meals served to Marines eating dinner in foxholes while their comrades fought and died 1,000 meters away. It was a new world, born in the coordination of steel and will, blood and procedure. Japan's commanders could not comprehend it because comprehension would have required abandoning everything they believed about warfare, about honor, about the human spirit itself. The Americans, unburdened by such philosophy, had simply solved the problem. And in solving it, they had built a machine so powerful, so adaptable, so fundamentally aligned with the trajectory of modernity itself, that it would define the character of organized violence for generations to come, long after the Marines had left Kwajalein's beaches, long after the last shell had fallen on Iwo Jima, echoing forward through history like the measured beat of a drum, precise and inexorable as sunrise.